One of the key reasons why the so-called woke movement is being rejected is because it reduces the human experience down to a singular layer of the 7-layer identity formation theory that I presented in the previous video. So the bedrock of the woke movement and the woke worldview, the idea that animates everything else that comes from it, is that some people are inherently and forever oppressors and others are inherently and forever oppressed. And that line is drawn by physical characteristics. Now that's the 7th layer of our self-identity, which is essentially the body, our family, and the genetics we're born into. And that this layer determines the outcome of the other layers. So we're all experiencing each of the 7 layers of our identity, and they all are informing our personal self-image. Whether it's something 100% personal, like the 2nd layer of our subjective psychological traits, or a group-informed identity, which is the 5th layer of our belief system, or say the 4th layer, our language. So critical race theory, it's a very elaborate worldview, and that is where the idea that our physical characteristics are determining the other layers. And the seeds of critical race theory were planted in universities with postmodernism and then post-structuralism. And that tree of that ideology bore its poisonous fruit from say 2016 to 2024. So what it's done, what the people who are proposing this ideology of this divide between oppressed and oppressors, whether they're doing it consciously or subconsciously, what they've done is that they've resurrected biological determinism, which according to Wikipedia, biological determinism is the belief that human behavior is directly controlled by an individual's genes or some component of their physiology, generally at the expense of the role of the environment, whether in embryonic development or in learning. So this is the worldview that brought about eugenics, where there was this argument that people need to be sterilized if they have inferior genes, if they are not optimal people according to their definition of what the best people should be, or just straight up genociding whole groups of people, because their behavior was automatically determined by their physical bodies. So that movement, you could say, died out after World War II to an extent, but what woke has done is it has dug up that grotesque body of ideas and reanimated it into the Frankenstein it has become today. So this Frankenstein, this dead body that they've exhumed, is biological determinism. And we're being told that, look, this is a human being, this is how human beings are. But that Frankenstein is not a human being. It's a dead body, or in this metaphor, it's a dead ideology being brought back to life, which is the biological determination of behavior. And it will eventually die simply because what they're claiming is not about what human beings are and what human nature is simply not true. And whatever is not in alignment with nature and truth will eventually wither away and become irrelevant. So the core falsehood in woke's claim on human nature is that the color of skin, which is the 7th layer of our identity, which is real, it's going to be determining our internal psychology, the 2nd layer. It's going to determine our actions, the 3rd layer. The worldview, the 5th layer. Our culture, the 6th layer. So essentially, the 7th layer becomes the most important aspect of one's self-identity. And it's not just influencing, but determining the outcomes of the other layers. So all the nuance of human experience is lost, and not even really lost. It's being disregarded. And I could spend an entire year making videos dissecting the flawed, presumptive, very aggressive and bigoted arguments being made by critical race theorists, but I just don't find it a valuable use of my time because there are textbooks, there's so much to this ideology that has been built up for so much time that I just think it would be repetitive. So many other people have done so much great work on getting into the weeds with it, and really explaining the contradictions and flaws in that way of thinking. But the perspective that I'm offering, which I hope can be a productive way of critiquing critical race theory and actually moving the conversation forward about what the actual process of identity formation is this model of the 7 layers of identity formation. So in my perspective, the key to moving the conversation forward is to see that each person uses each layer to ultimately define themselves. And we're incorporating different layers in different proportions. And again, probably most importantly, one layer is not determining the others. So for example, having white skin doesn't determine your psychology. The 6th layer, the cultural customs layer, it doesn't determine your psychology either. It can greatly influence it, of course, but we all have choices and we all can change ourselves. We become different people and we don't have to accept other people's definitions of who we are, obviously. And we are not born into a body that is going to set everything else in motion, and that we are just, essentially what woke does is it tries to define people under very strict terms that they can't reject. So for example, we all have this capacity to change. So for example, if you are born into a family and live in a culture where you're taught that all white people are colonizers, not distinguishing between different groups of quote unquote white, say people from Finland or people from Australia or people from Russia, just blanket white, they're all colonizers. Or if you're born into a family and an ideology where you're told that all is people who practice the religion of Islam are inherently violent, your psychology is going to be affected by that. But nothing about that upbringing, about your genetics, about your language, your belief system is set in stone and impossible to change. Even language, you can learn a new language. Your native tongue is, in a way you could say, permanently part of who you are, but there's other possibilities of learning other languages and then opening up to, therefore, other ways of seeing the world. Language is a way to see and deconstruct the patterns of the world. Languages see the world in different ways. So you have this possibility to always be changing things about yourself. So it's woke's underlying idea of human psychology, which is flawed, and which leads them to make these sweeping, snap judgments and generalizations about entire populations. Needless to say, about the snap judgments they're making about individual people and assuming what they think and what they feel and how they see the world. So despite the ardent and decades-long attempt to define people about their physical characteristics by bringing everything back to that 7th layer of their identity, it's become people can see that it has become a very infantile explanation for behavior, and it cannot tolerate criticism of its core assumption about human nature. So they're rolling out this Frankenstein, using this metaphor of a Frankenstein. They're rolling out this Frankenstein, this dead belief of biological determinism, and they're saying, this is a complete human being. And when you look at it and you say, no, that's just a cadaver, that's just physical flesh being artificially pumped up by electricity, the energy they're putting into it, they can't tolerate someone saying no. And they can't tolerate someone saying that, no, that's just a body you've electrified. That's a dead theory that you're just bringing to life again. That's not the same thing as this human being over here. That's not the same as me. That Frankenstein, the soul has already left that body, and it's no longer the same as a living human being. So they're defining human nature in a certain way that is totally incomplete and not real. And they don't want anyone to be able to say that, no. They want everyone to say, yep, that Frankenstein is just the same as another person, as a living person. And so that gets to the point of the most glaring flaw of the woke system, which is the lack of any kind of spiritual dimension to it. It is a cult-like, it is a cult-like religion, which is the 5th layer of a belief system. It is a very robust belief system, but that's not spirituality. And the spiritual dimension that it doesn't have, which Frankensteins don't have, is that every human being is a soul has a soul within it that does not die when the body dies. Our soul moves on from our current existence when our bodies die. So souls that are obsessed with their bodies after they die, they want to hang around the body. And that's why there are ghosts that hang around bodies in graveyards. They haven't moved on from the life that they've lived. So they want to hang around the body. So that's, ghosts who haven't moved on to a new, or souls that haven't moved on remain ghosts. And that's why in the Vedic culture, it is recommended to cremate bodies, so the soul is forced to move on, that they can't latch on to their physical existence anymore. So woke is a very materialistic, and I would argue atheistic paradigm that has closed itself off from the most important layer of our self-identity, the core and truest part of our identity, which is the soul, the core layer in the seven layers. So in 2020, I released a film called Vedic Nights, which is based on the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is a scripture from ancient India that tells mythologies and the teachings of the Vedic culture. And it's actually the first live-action film in English based on this ancient text. So the basic teaching in the Srimad Bhagavatam is that we are all slaves to materialistic desires, and we are forced to repeat lives endlessly until we realize the futility of the fleeting passions of material existence. And instead we begin to seek union with God through spiritual evolution at the negation of materialistic desires. We are seeking to become more unified and in harmony with the spiritual dimension within us. So the film that I made, it approaches this concept it has two storylines, and one of the storylines is about a young painter his work depicts the black struggle and slavery. And he gets manipulated by two Vedic deities, two higher beings that are essentially working to teach him something. And those two beings are Krishna and Radha. And what they're doing is that they manipulate him into signing a contract and thus becoming a slave himself to a shadowy organization that takes complete control over his work. So the painter, while depicting slavery, becomes a slave himself to his materialistic desire for success. So there's this entrapment process that we all have to learn from, of digging deeper into our materialistic world. So when I first started writing Vedic Nights in 2016, and still today, I feel this need for the Western world to investigate and embrace the ideas inherent in the Vedic worldview, because we wouldn't fall into these traps that what woke materialism and other materialistic ideologies do, because at the heart of our experience as human beings is this soul's journey. We have the truest part of ourselves has a purpose, and the more we come in contact with this infinite part of ourselves, and the more that we're able to really live a more fulfilling life and see beyond just this simplistic materialistic way of defining the world, which is essentially what that Frankenstein of woke ideology is. It's just you're your body, and everything else is determined by your body and your physical characteristics. But we as conscious human beings are much, much more than that, and than what we've been taught in the Western world. And the way that we form our identities, the way we form this idea of who we are, is so much more profound and changeable, and that we're not slaves to our genes, and we don't have to be slaves to our desires as we choose to evolve, using the knowledge of this soul layer as the core of our true identity, as the core of who we really are, which then can inform the other layers of our consciousness, and we can grow to a more complete understanding of human beings and of human nature.